The Story of Jonah by David Kossoff. Chapter 1. Don't Argue. George Gershwin, in his opera Porgy and Bess, wrote a song called It Ain't Necessarily So. A funny song. One of its verses goes like this. Now Jonah he lived in a whale. Now Jonah he lived in a whale. He made his home in that fish's abdomen. That Jonah he lived in a whale. Well, it ain't necessarily so. At least, it ain't necessarily all there is to Jonah. You ask anyone about Jonah and they say, "Ah, yes, well, Jonah and the whale." You ask them who he was, what he did, where he lived, how he came to be in the whale, not many could tell you. I can tell you. Wonderful story. Comes from a wonderful book. First, who was Jonah? Well, he was a prophet. Now perhaps when I say prophet, you get a picture in your mind of a gentle, elderly man with a long white beard and a faraway look in his wise old eyes. Not Jonah. He didn't want to be a prophet. He was not very good at it. And he was very cross about having to be one for most of the time he was one. Not that being cross did him any good. Indeed, if he'd been more cheerful and less disobedient, he wouldn't have found himself inside a whale. Mind you, the way things worked out, it would have made anybody cross. Still, I'd better begin at the beginning. Jonah was quite an ordinary man, not rich, not poor, rather inclined to argue with anybody. Hard-headed, obstinate sort of chap. Even when he received a message direct from God, he argued. In those days, people were somehow closer to God. They spoke to him any time in ordinary words. If they had something to say, they said it simply, as people should. They didn't look up a prayer in a book. Anyway, not many folk could read in those times. Not many books. No Bible. Those people were the Bible. The Bible is their story. So you see, when Jonah began to sleep badly and began to have a feeling that something was going to happen, he wasn't filled with fear or anything. He was just a bit cross about losing sleep and feeling tense. Then it happened. Suddenly, straight into Jonah's mind, God spoke. Unmistakably God. And Jonah knew it. God spoke clearly. "Jonah," he said, "I have an errand for you. I want you to go to the great city of Nineveh and tell them that I know how wicked they've all become, and that in 40 days from your arrival the city will be destroyed, and the people will perish." Jonah thought for a minute, and then decided to argue. "Look, God," he said, "Nineveh is a long way, and it's not the time of the year for long journeys. It's too hot. But the main point is, God," he said, "I don't want to be made to look foolish. Look," he said, "you're not the kind of God that destroys cities and wipes out thousands of people. You're gracious and kind and slow to anger and merciful, and everyone knows it. I'll go all that way, make a lot of speeches, and nothing will happen, and I'll look silly." There was a little pause, and then God, who was rather used to people like Jonah, said, "Leave first thing in the morning." And Jonah knew that he'd better shut up. The next morning, very bad-tempered, he packed a few things together and started the long, hot walk to Nineveh. He was cross when he set off, and by the time he got to Jaffa, he was even more cross. Now the fact that Jaffa was a port gave him an idea. He said to himself, I won't go to Nineveh at all. I'll get on a ship and I'll go to Tarshish in Spain. I'll hide. Who wants to be a prophet and be made to look daft? He found a ship that was going to Tarshish, bought his ticket and went aboard, and then, well, I'll tell you in a moment. Chapter 2, Shipwreck. You remember earlier I told you how Jonah decided not to go to Nineveh as God had told him to, but to go by sea to Tarshish instead. Very silly, as he was soon to find out. He boarded the ship, went below, and very tired from his long walk, he dropped into a deep sleep. The captain ordered the anchor lifted, and they set sail for Tarshish. A hot, calm day with a slight sea breeze. Very pleasant. Jonah slept on. Now God, who was a little surprised at Jonah's disobedience, decided to take a hand. The skies became grey and leaden. The breeze stopped. Everything grew still and close, and then suddenly, from nowhere, the hurricane struck. Panic was everywhere. Passengers and crew screamed and shouted and were full of fear. Jonah, below in a corner of the hold, slept on. The captain ordered everyone to pray to their various gods. Sacrifices were offered, but of course nothing happened. The great roaring wind did not lessen one bit. Then the captain came upon Jonah fast asleep and woke him roughly. "Ah," said Jonah, "are we there?" "There," said the captain. "The only place we're likely to be is at the bottom of the sea. Never known a storm like it. Sea's gone mad. Come on," he said. "Up on deck. I've got everyone praying to their various gods to try and stop it. Up you go," he said. "Get started." When Jonah came out on deck into the screaming wind and among the weeping, praying people, he knew at once what was up. The captain said, "Get busy. Start praying to your gods. We've tried all the obvious ones, the god of wind and the sea god and the sail god and the anchor god, but it's no good. Go on, get started." Jonah took the captain to one side. "Look," he said, "it's my God. I'm a Hebrew, and we only have one. There is only one, and he looks after everything. I've done something I shouldn't have, or rather, I haven't done something I should have, and this hurricane is all my fault." "Well," the captain said, "do something about it. Start praying." Jonah said, "I don't think it would do any good. If I were you, I'd have me chucked overboard. I've got a very strong feeling that's the only solution." The captain said, "No, I couldn't do a thing like that. Had my own ship 30 years and never lost a passenger yet. You can't go chucking. It's against the regulations. Besides, it may not work, and in these seas I couldn't guarantee to fish you out again. Also, quite frankly, I don't really believe there's only one God. Seems like a lot of work for just one. Try praying. I'll come back." But the storm grew worse, and somehow the word got round among the terrified people that it was all Jonah's fault. Jonah sat sadly, and when the captain came back, followed by the crew and passengers, Jonah could see that his suggestion about being tossed overside was about to be taken up. He got to his feet, apologized to the captain, and allowed himself to be dropped over the side. Immediately the sea became calm, and the hurricane died away, and the sun came out, and the sky became blue. As Jonah floated away from the ship, he could hear the captain leading prayers to the one and only God. Jonah floated on his back, looking up to heaven and thinking, now what? Time passed, and now Jonah was all alone. Calm blue sea, clear blue sky, silence. Suddenly he was aware of being caught in a current. He turned over and looked ahead. He saw an odd sort of small island. It had no trees, seemed quite smooth. The current was swifter and was carrying him towards a sort of small cave. As he drew nearer, he looked up and saw an amazing, frightening thing. He saw... I'll tell you in a moment. Chapter 3. Inside Information. Well, there was Jonah. God had sent him to deliver a message which Jonah thought would make him look silly, so he hadn't gone. At least he'd hidden himself in the hold of a ship and gone somewhere else. As if hiding yourself is any good, as he soon found out. Now he wasn't in the ship. He was in the sea all alone, and a strong current was taking him towards a small island, which had no trees and seemed quite smooth. He was being carried into a sort of cave. He looked up, and above the cave at each side were small, bad-tempered eyes. It was a whale. As Jonah opened his mouth to yell, the whale shut his mouth with a snap, with Jonah inside. And this is the part of the story that everyone knows. Jonah swallowed by the whale. But it's not the end of the story, or the best part. Mind you, a man trying to be clever with God and getting shipwrecked and then swallowed by a whale is not a bad story to be going on with. So silly of Jonah. As a friend of mine used to say, never box outside your weight. Yes, where was I? Oh yes, Jonah in the whale. He was cold, wet, very frightened, and he didn't like the dark and never had. There he sat inside the whale. He didn't even know what he was sitting on, and started to have a think about things. All right, he said to himself, and his voice sounded echoey and spooky. All right, I disobeyed, but he could have sent someone else. I'm nobody. The message could have been given to someone important, a priest or a prince or something, not to me. I'm nobody. And the words, I'm nobody, went on echoing and ringing round the great vaulted inside of the whale for far longer than the other words, until Jonah's head was banging. And then suddenly all was deathly quiet. Jonah now was looking at himself very honestly and seeing himself very clearly. You can when it's pitch dark. Have you noticed? Jonah saw that he was really at a very low point, the lowest ever, lost, alone, very unhappy, and all really his own fault. Maybe this down into the depths and then being saved is what the Jonah and the whale story really means. But let's not get theological and get on with saving Jonah. He now felt very humble and very wretched. He asked God to give him another chance. He promised to do as he was told. He remembered and was grateful for all the good things in his life given to him by God, and he spoke quietly and sadly into the vast listening silence for quite a while. When he'd finished, he felt better, of course. Well, nothing happened for a bit, and then far off Jonah saw a golden glow. After the darkness it hurt his eyes a bit. It got no bigger. Jonah got up, stretched his cramped legs, and walked forward. The glowing, shining spot grew larger. Jonah walked faster, and along the whale's tongue, and out through the whale's open mouth, and on to dry land. The glow was God's sunshine, and the gold was the yellow sand. Jonah stood and wept with relief and joy. As his clothes dried in the hot sun, they began to smell a bit fishy, but he kept his mouth tight shut about it. He offered up a heartfelt prayer of thanks to God. Then he waited, but nothing happened. So Jonah thought that perhaps the subject ought to be broached by him. God, he said, I haven't forgotten the message, not a word. You said I was to go to Nineveh and tell them that you know all about their wickedness, and that in 40 days, after I get there, the city will be destroyed and the people will perish. That's what you said. I was to go and tell them. And God, he said, I'll go right away. And he did. In a moment I'll tell you how he got on. Chapter 4. City in Sackcloth. Well, there stood Jonah outside the gates of Nineveh. He'd had a pretty rough time just lately. He'd been given an errand by God which he'd disobeyed, so he'd been shipwrecked, swallowed by a whale, coughed up again on dry land, forgiven, and here he was, where he would have been anyway if he'd not disobeyed. There's a moral in there somewhere. Never mind. Jonah stood a moment to get the words right, and then marched into the city, shouting the message God had given him. In 40 days, he shouted, in 40 days Nineveh shall be destroyed, and its people shall perish, for the Lord knows how wicked you've all become. Very impressive place, Nineveh. For those days a big city. 120,000 people lived there. And God was right. The people were wicked and cruel, and they had forgotten him. At first they all laughed at Jonah and were rather rude. But there was something about this cross little man, and eventually Jonah was brought before the king. The king told him to stop shouting and to tell his story, including God's message, quietly, which Jonah did. The king listened in silence and realized that it was all true. He had ruled badly, and the people had all gone to the bad. He had a long, serious talk with his government, and they issued a great proclamation. It said that everyone was to fast. They were to pray to God for forgiveness. They were to dress in sackcloth, and they were to stop their violence and evil ways. Then the king himself dressed in sackcloth and began his fast. Jonah watched all this without saying too much. He'd told his story and he'd delivered the message. If this huge city had got themselves into this highly dangerous position, it was their lookout. Mind you, in his heart of hearts, Jonah didn't really believe that God would carry out his threat of complete annihilation, but he said nothing. He walked in the city and observed everything and wondered. In the course of a few days, he saw a whole city change its ways. The gambling and the debauchery and the cruelty and the evil and the selfishness disappeared. The people walked in fear of the Lord, silent, fasting, praying. They had compassion and sympathy for each other. They had, as my father used to say, time for people. There was no panic evacuation. They knew from Jonah's own story that he told everywhere that running away was no good. The city grew hushed and still as the days passed by. 40 days, God had said. 40. The reason why Jonah told his story so often was not to frighten people, but he was rather surprised to discover clumsily to comfort them. After all, God had forgiven him. He'd been swallowed by a whale. But the days passed, and there was no sign of any kind. One day the king, who was now very pale and thin, and wasn't a bad chap really, said to Jonah, "Who knows?" he said. "Who knows, Jonah? Perhaps God may yet forgive us all. Perhaps he will lose his fierce anger and change his mind so that we don't all perish. Who knows?" "Ah," said Jonah, who had his own ideas as to how likely the merciful God was to wipe out 120,000 people. "Ah," he said, "who knows?" Now the time was nearly up. The people were hollow-cheeked and weary. Even the most hardened evil-doers had mended their ways. There was no gossip, no rumours, no lies, no slander, no raised voices. Truth and honesty had come. People rediscovered simple values, and they blamed only themselves and repented and prayed from the heart for forgiveness. And of course God did forgive them. You cannot imagine such joy. It was like V-Day and New Year's Eve, and a great noisy wedding rolled into one. Every single person was filled with joy, except one. Jonah. Jonah, who all the time had been pretty certain it wouldn't happen, when it didn't happen, went very strange indeed. I'll tell you in what way in a moment. Chapter 5. Get the point. Well, yesterday we ended up in Nineveh, a great city for those days, of 120,000 people. Until very recently they'd all been very wicked and ungodly indeed. Jonah had been sent by God to tell them that in 40 days God, who knew all about them, was going to wipe them off the face of the earth. Jonah, who didn't want the job of taking such a message, had disobeyed God, and had been shipwrecked and swallowed by a whale for a while to teach him a lesson. So he'd taken the message, watched the entire population change its ways, and wasn't really all that surprised when God forgave them all. No, he wasn't surprised. He was cross. He was so cross, so angry, that he rushed out of the city and sat on a stone in the hot sun and sulked. Meanwhile, the city went mad with joy, and God smiled down upon them. Sometimes when children get too out of hand, the lesson has to be a hard one. It was some time before God noticed that Jonah was not among the dancing, happy multitude, and God went and asked him what was wrong. "Well," said Jonah, who was now right back to his old argumentative self. "Well, I was right. When you spoke to me at home about coming all this way with that all wiped out in 40 days message, I knew you wouldn't do it. I know you. You're not vengeful. You forgive people. I told you then I didn't want to come and be made to look silly. That was why I disobeyed you and caught a ship to Tarshish instead. And all that business with the hurricane and that great smelly whale. I've frightened a lot of people half to death, and I've had some very nasty experiences, and all for nothing. So if you don't mind, I'm going to sit here in the hot sun till I die." God said gently, "Do you think you are right to be angry?" But Jonah refused to answer, and by nightfall poor Jonah was feeling very unwell. During the night God made a large tree suddenly grow, and all next day Jonah sat in its shade and began to feel better. During the next night God caused the tree to wither and die, and the next day Jonah, as the sun burned down again on his head, again told God he wished only to die. He felt very miserable and hard done by, and what with the heat and the dust and a very nasty east wind which had started up, he began to feel a bit odd in the head too. "After doing all those things to me," he muttered to himself, "the shipwreck and the whale and the long walk and the waiting round in Nineveh for 40 days, the least he could have done was to have kept his word and wiped 'em all out. The least." The sun grew hotter and the dust worse. Poor Jonah slept a while, and when God asked him again if he still wanted only to die, he said wearily, "Yes, Lord, I really think I'll be better off dead. I've had enough. Oh, one more thing before I finish," he said. "I want you to know I appreciated the tree. It was a nice thought, but, as you can see, the poor thing's withered away. Shame. Beautiful tree. Oh, well." There was a sound which might have been the wind, but which sounded like a loving chuckle. Then God spoke. "Poor thing," he said. "You feel sorry for the tree, Jonah? You think it's a shame?" "Well, yes," said Jonah. "Well, Jonah," said God, "if you feel sorry for the tree which cost you nothing, which you didn't plant or tend, which gave you no trouble, should I not feel sorry for Nineveh? Should I not spare 120,000 people over whom I've taken a great deal of trouble? They may be foolish and slow to learn right from wrong, but Jonah, should I not spare them?" And Jonah at last got the point. Did you? And that was Jonah and the Whale, read by Nick Martin.